When we're looking at our second and third class levers, what makes it similar is that both the effort force and the resistance force is on the same side of the axis. So when we look at our first class lever with a balance lever, the fulcrum was in the middle and you had your effort and your resistance forces on either side. What this does in these second and third class levers, when you have both the force and the load on the same side, it gets in situations where you can manipulate the effort or the resistance to make the system easier or harder. And when you see here the plus and minus, the plus uh, indicates that it is making it more challenging, and with the negative, it means it's making it easier. So if I have here the resistive force and the effort force, resistive force is your load, like the weight you're trying to move, and the effort force is either the muscle attachment or you, the human, trying to change something within that system. And the big takeaway from this is that distance changes the effort or the challenge of the system. And typically the thought process is whoever has distance on its side or on their side tends to have an advantage. Now, that is true when you're comparing the effort versus the resistance. Whoever has the further distance, like this in a second class lever, or I'm sorry, in this case, what we're seeing here is a third class lever, the effort and the load you're trying to move is further away. So the resistance has the advantage because it has further distance. You look at all three of these points, 1, 2, and 3, and all three of those points are further away from these 3 points here. When we look at the third class lever, typically the second class lever, the effort would be way out here. So like a wheelbarrow where you have your load here and here's your load, your resistance, and your effort's in this direction. But the point we're trying to illustrate here is that when you're looking at either a second or third class lever, when everything's on the same side of the axis of rotation, which is right here, there's your axis, that if I were to take, like, say, this 10-pound block and I move it further away from the axis of rotation, it becomes more challenging to move. It's 10 pounds is 10 pounds plus, let's say this is 10 feet. This is 100 foot-pound of torque. If I take that 10-pound block and I move it 2 feet further out this direction, now it's 120 pounds of torque. If I take that same 10-pound block and I move it in 2 feet, now it's 80 pounds of torque. So the weight of the block never changes. The torque, or the amount of rotation it's creating, changes based on the distance. If you remember, torque is equal to force times the distance, or that moment arm. Oh, I went off the screen there. I'm sorry, but torque is equal to force times distance. Okay, so the force never changes. This 10 pounds is always 10 pounds. What changes is the distance from that axis of rotation. Now, if I look down here at the effort, which would usually be the muscle force, if I attach, let's say, here's my muscle attached to there, and you really can't change the muscle. So let's say this is someone pulling on a cable, and it can be a pull or a push in this case. So here, when I added distance to it, when I moved it further from the axis of rotation, it became more challenging because the torque increased. As I moved that force outward, it went from 100 foot-pounds of torque to 120. So now I had to come up with more effort, more resistance to do that. Now, if I look here at the effort, what I meant to say is I came up with more effort to overcome that greater resistance. If I do the same thing, if I move my effort further away from the axis like I did here, whereas this got more challenging, this made the system easier. And you can see that's noted by that negative sign there. It took challenge away from the system. And what's happening is my effort that I'm putting here is being amplified by that additional distance. Conversely, when I move this block towards the axis of rotation, it got easier. If I move my effort towards the axis of rotation, I'm putting myself at a disadvantage. So the takeaway here is that distance does change how much something rotate, the effort at which, or the load or force at which it can rotate. In this case, when you're gaining distance for your resistance, it's making things harder. With the effort, if you're gaining distance, it's making things easier. So just be clear on what a question might be asking you, or kind of being able to think through the logic of, am I talking about the resistance or am I talking about the effort? If I'm talking about the resistance, also referred to as the load, like the weight that I'm trying to move, if I'm gaining distance through the load, it's going to become harder to move. If I'm losing distance from the load, it's going to be easier to move. Conversely, if I'm taking my effort and I'm moving it further away from the axis of rotation or using a tool that can do that, I'm amplifying my effort. If I'm moving my effort closer to the axis of rotation, I'm diminishing my effort.